Hey everyone, it's Maya with the CSU Bug Zoo, and today I'm going to talk to you about isopods. These are isopods, and isopods are really interesting animals, especially because they're crustaceans. So they're in the same family as things like lobsters and crabs and even crayfish. But what's really neat is most of the isopods that we see, like all of these ones, are terrestrial isopods. So that means that they've evolved to have gills, but those gills can breathe air on land. So whenever you see isopods, you mostly find them under wood or under rocks or somewhere where it's really damp and moist. And that's because they still use gills to breathe. Where would you expect to find some isopods? Isopods are found on every continent except for Antarctica, unless you're counting ocean isopods, in which case you'd even find them around the coast of Antarctica. But terrestrial isopods are on every continent in every environment. Most isopods are living on forest floors underneath things like leaf litter and rotten wood, but you can also find them on sidewalks here in Colorado. Now, most of the ones you find on sidewalks here in Colorado are on sidewalks because they actually have a certain parasite, and that parasite drives them to go out onto the sidewalk where they're really visible and get eaten by birds. And that's because the parasite in the isopods needs the birds to keep on living, which is crazy because there's a little parasite that drives those little isopods crazy. And when you see them on the sidewalk, almost all the ones you see are ones that have that parasite. Isopods are really important because they are part of the nutrient cycle for carbon and nitrogen. They're called detritivores, which means that they're eating detritus, so things that are rotting on the floor. So rotten wood, you can see they've munched away at this rotten wood. You can see that they've skeletonized these leaves. They've done this. This is a really big colony, so it took them about 3 days to eat through all these leaves, which is crazy. And so that's mostly what they eat is rotten vegetable matter. But occasionally they'll eat rotten animals as well, so they help to decompose things on the forest floor and return those nutrients to soil so that the soil stays healthy in their environment. While they eat mostly rotten things, some of the things they also need are calcium to provide their shell and protein. So at the Bug Zoo, I actually make them a specialized diet. That specialized diet uses alfalfa, bee pollen, some dried river shrimp. I also add in a little bit of cornmeal and dried leaves, and then algae. So I actually have some purple algae, so seaweed, for fish, and I give them a little bit of that with some ground up eggshells for calcium, and that's what I feed them. So I'll give them a little right now, and we can watch them eat for a second. Another really cool thing about isopods is the fact that they have something called a marsupium. And only the females have it, and marsupium is a word that you might be familiar with because it sounds like marsupial. So marsupials are a type of mammal that have a pouch, and they develop their babies in a pouch. And isopods do that too, which is crazy. So they have little pouches that they carry their babies on, and once those babies get big enough, they'll come out of the pouch and they'll live. And sometimes in certain species, they'll come back and forth and they'll live with the mother for a while, which is nuts. And that's what makes them such successful animals, because they can have hundreds of little babies and they keep them close instead of just leaving them to fend for themselves, like a lot of other arthropods do. Some isopods have continuous breeding. So these are Porciella scaber. They're a special breed made to look orange. They're sometimes called orange scabers. And they continuously breed, which is why we can have such a big population in here. Other species, though, only breed one time a year, and only if the conditions are right. So you have to make sure that it's the right temperature, they need a cool period, or it's not too wet, or it's not too dry to get them to breed. But these ones, this species, they're pretty easy. They're a really hardy species. A lot of people like to keep isopods as either pets, which is what we do at the Bug Zoo. We keep them to help clean up, or to help with disposing of things that you don't want anymore. So, like I mentioned, these ones are going to eat anything that's rotting. Why do people keep isopods? That's an interesting question because there's a lot of different reasons why. At the Bug Zoo, we keep 6 different species of isopod, and we're using them for different things. So the species we have here, which are the orange isopods, we use these mostly to help feed other smaller animals that aren't big enough to eat things like crickets. So we feed our black widows isopods, we feed some of our different true spiders isopods, our baby scorpions get isopods, but other people keep isopods for cleanup crews because they eat all this rotting matter. So one of the things you'll see people keep isopods for is to put into their vivariums or their bioactive enclosures. Those are enclosures that have a full little ecosystem in them, so you don't have to clean them as much. And people will use isopods to help clean up because they like to eat poop, which is gross, but it's a good thing because otherwise you have a lot of poop in your tank and you don't want to clean it up. So you throw in some isopods. It really depends on what species you use, because something like this, like a Porciella scaber, are really driven by protein. So we've kept them with other things like cockroaches in the past, and they'll actually go and eat the cockroaches. So we've lost entire colonies of cockroaches keeping them with Porciella before. But there's hundreds of other species of isopod out there, and so if you use a different species that's a little bit less protein driven, they make really good additions to a terrarium to help clean up poop, or if you've got something like a tarantula, help eat that tarantula's exoskeleton after they molt. So these ones will eat almost anything you put in there. You can see they've got a little bit of a leftover carrot from earlier in the week, but a lot of people keep them for their terrariums or to help feed smaller animals that aren't big enough to be eating more traditional feeders. There are a bunch of different species of isopod out there, and there's a huge difference between isopods that are considered more like the sow bugs versus those that are more like roly-polies. So roly-polies are famous for being able to curl up in a ball, whereas something like a sow bug, like what you see here, can't roll up. So this is another type of Porciella scaber, but this kind has been bred instead of being orange and white like a Dalmatian. You can see there's a couple of different ones in here too. And if we look at another species, we can see some that roll up that have been bred to look interesting. So if we look in here, I have Armadillium maculatum, which means, maculata means striped, and this is called a zebra isopod. And they call them zebra isopods because they're striped, black and white. But you can also find ones that have been bred to be red and white, or like a chocolatey brown and white, or even yellow and white. So there's a lot of crazy breeding that people have done to get different colors, kind of like what people do with snakes. And these ones are different than the scabers I showed you before because they can roll into a ball, like a roly-poly. As I mentioned before, isopods can be found all over the world, and they come in a bunch of different colors. This is a really cool species from Spain. They're from the mountains of Spain. It's called Porciella haasi, H-A-A-S-I, and they get really large. They can get between 3 and 4 centimeters, which is an inch and a half or bigger. And they kind of like things a little bit more dry, so they do pretty well here in Colorado where it's very dry. And they've got that fantastic yellow and black coloration, which is just awesome looking. Another really interesting species is this one here. It's called the Armadillium klugi, and it's a special morph called the Montenegro morph. They are from, surprisingly, Montenegro and along the coastline of the Adriatic Sea. And these ones are really interesting because they've got that red lining and then little yellow and white spots. Let's see if we can see more of them. And hanging out in there with them are these little things called collembola, which are sometimes also called springtails. And springtails are one of the only other animals you want to keep with isopods because they help them keep clean. So springtails are also detritivores that are helping to eat rotten stuff. and they're helping to eat more of the mold stuff that can grow in with isopods, so you like to have both springtails and isopods kept together.